Maria wiped the sweat from her forehead as she walked out of Danny's diner at 11:30 p.m. Her feet ached from standing for 8 straight hours, and her uniform smelled like grease and coffee. The dinner rush had been brutal tonight, with cranky customers and a broken coffee machine that made everything twice as hard. She pulled her phone from her pocket and checked her bank balance one more time. After paying for groceries and her son's school supplies, she had exactly $43 left until Friday. That meant pasta for dinner tomorrow and maybe some canned beans if she was lucky. At 32 years old, Maria never imagined her life would be this hard, but here she was, working 3 jobs just to keep her 2 kids fed and housed. The parking lot was empty except for her beat-up Honda Civic, which made a weird rattling sound every time she started it. She really needed to get it fixed, but car repairs weren't in the budget right now. Nothing fun was in the budget, actually. When was the last time she bought herself something that wasn't absolutely necessary? She couldn't even remember. Maria climbed into her car and turned the key. The engine coughed and wheezed before finally coming to life. She backed out slowly, trying not to think about what would happen if this car died on her. Without it, she couldn't get to any of her jobs. Without her jobs, she couldn't pay rent. Without rent money, she and the kids would be homeless. It was a terrifying cycle that kept her awake most nights. Instead of taking the main road home, Maria decided to cut through the woods behind Riverside Heights. It was the fancy neighborhood where she cleaned houses twice a week for rich families who left $100 bills lying around like pocket change. The shortcut would save her 10 minutes and half a gallon of gas, which might not sound like much, but every penny counted when you were living paycheck to paycheck. The narrow dirt path through the woods was bumpy and dark, lit only by her headlights cutting through the thick trees. Maria had discovered this route 6 months ago when construction on Main Street forced her to find another way home. Now she used it regularly, even though it always felt a little spooky at night. The trees seemed to close in around her car, and strange shadows danced in her peripheral vision. Tonight felt different, though. As Maria drove slowly along the familiar path, something caught her eye. She slowed down even more, squinting through the darkness. About 20 feet off the trail, near a cluster of old oak trees, the ground looked wrong somehow. It was disturbed, like someone had been digging there recently. Fresh dirt was piled up in a small mound, and there were obvious signs that the earth had been moved around. Maria's heart started beating faster. Living in the city had taught her to be careful, and her instincts were telling her that something wasn't right about this scene. She almost kept driving. Part of her wanted to just go home, check on her sleeping children, and pretend she hadn't seen anything unusual. Getting involved in other people's problems was a luxury she couldn't afford, but something made her stop the car and turn off the engine. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was the same instinct that made her check on elderly neighbors and help lost tourists find their way. Maria had always been the type of person who couldn't walk past someone in trouble, even when helping them might cause problems for her own life. She grabbed her phone and turned on the flashlight app. The bright white light cut through the darkness as she stepped out of her car and walked carefully toward the disturbed ground. Her sneakers crunched on fallen leaves and small twigs. Every sound seemed amplified in the quiet woods, and Maria found herself looking over her shoulder every few seconds. As she got closer to the mound of dirt, Maria noticed something that made her stomach drop. There was a small piece of dark fabric sticking up from the ground, barely visible in the dim light. It looked like part of a jacket or shirt sleeve, and it was moving slightly in the night breeze. But as Maria watched more carefully, she realized the movement wasn't from the wind at all. The fabric was moving because someone was breathing underneath it. Maria's hands started shaking as the horrible truth hit her. Someone was buried under this pile of dirt, and they were still alive. She dropped to her knees beside the mound and started digging with her bare hands, frantically pushing away dirt and dead leaves. Her fingernails broke and her palms got scraped by rocks, but she didn't care. Someone needed her help right now. "Hey," she called out, hoping the person could hear her. "I'm here to help you. Just hang on, okay?" The dirt was loosely packed, thank goodness, so it came away fairly easily. Maria dug as fast as she could, following the piece of fabric down into the ground. After what felt like forever but was probably only a few minutes, her fingers touched something warm and soft. It was a person's shoulder. Working even faster now, Maria cleared away dirt from around the person's head and neck. Soon she could see a man's face, pale and covered with soil. His eyes were closed and his lips looked blue, but she could see his chest moving up and down in shallow breaths. He was unconscious but definitely alive. Maria brushed dirt away from his mouth and nose, being as gentle as she could. The man's face was bruised and swollen, like someone had beaten him up pretty badly before burying him here. He was probably in his 40s, with graying hair and what looked like expensive clothes under all the dirt. "Come on," Maria whispered, patting his cheek lightly. "Wake up, you're safe now." The man's eyes fluttered open suddenly and he gasped like someone who had been drowning. He tried to sit up but started coughing violently, spitting out dirt and breathing in huge gulps of air. Maria helped support him as his body shook with the effort of staying conscious. When the coughing fit ended, the man looked at Maria with wide, terrified eyes. He seemed confused and disoriented, like he couldn't quite believe what was happening. His expensive watch was cracked and his suit jacket was torn in several places. This wasn't some homeless person who had gotten into trouble. This was clearly a wealthy man who had somehow ended up buried alive in the woods. "Who are you?" the man whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. "My name is Maria," she said, still helping him sit up. "I was driving by and saw the disturbed ground." "Are you hurt? Should I call an ambulance?" The man grabbed her wrist with surprising strength, for someone who had just been dug out of a grave. His grip was desperate, almost painful, and his eyes filled with a fear that went way beyond what had just happened to him. "No," he said urgently, his voice getting stronger. "No ambulance, no police. Please, you have to promise me. They'll kill my little girl if you call anyone." Maria stared at him, trying to process what he had just said. This wasn't just some random crime or accident. This man was in serious danger, and apparently so was his daughter. Whatever had happened here was bigger and more dangerous than Maria had realized. And now, whether she wanted to or not, she was right in the middle of it. Maria helped the man to his feet, her mind racing with questions she was afraid to ask. He was taller than she had realized, probably around 6 feet, and despite being covered in dirt and looking like he'd been through hell, there was something about him that screamed money. His watch, even though it was cracked, looked like it cost more than Maria made in 6 months. His shoes were expensive leather, now scuffed and dirty but clearly custom-made. "What's your name?" Maria asked, steadying him as he swayed slightly. "David," he said, still breathing heavily. "David Chen. I own Chen Financial downtown." He paused, looking at her with a mixture of gratitude and desperation. "You probably don't know the company, but we manage investments for some very wealthy people." Maria had heard of Chen Financial. She'd seen their sleek glass building when she rode the bus downtown for her weekend cleaning jobs. It was one of those fancy places with marble floors and security guards in expensive suits, the kind of place where Maria would never belong, where people like her were invisible unless they were emptying trash cans or mopping floors. "How did you end up buried in the woods?" she asked, though part of her wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. David's face went pale, and he looked around nervously, as if expecting someone to jump out from behind the trees. "3 days ago, I discovered something at my company, something that certain people would kill to keep secret." He wiped dirt from his mouth with a shaking hand. "I was leaving my apartment building Tuesday night when 2 men grabbed me in the parking garage. They threw me into a van and took me to some warehouse." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. This sounded like something from a movie, not real life. But the bruises on David's face and the genuine terror in his eyes told her this was very real. "What did they want from you?" she asked quietly. "Information, files, passwords to accounts." David's voice cracked slightly. "They wanted me to help them cover up what I'd discovered. When I refused, they beat me up and threatened my daughter. When I still wouldn't cooperate, they said they were going to kill me and make it look like an accident." Maria's heart sank. As a mother herself, she couldn't imagine the terror of having your child threatened. Her own kids were safe at home with her neighbor watching them, but this man's little girl was apparently still in danger. "They have your daughter?" Maria asked, dreading the answer. David nodded, tears mixing with the dirt on his cheeks. "Lisa is 8 years old. She was supposed to be staying with her grandmother this week, while I was traveling for business. But when I called the house yesterday, no one answered. Then one of those men showed me a photo on his phone." His voice broke completely. "She was tied up in some room I didn't recognize, crying and asking for her daddy." Maria felt sick. She thought about her own 8-year-old son, Tommy, sleeping peacefully in his bed right now. The idea of someone taking him and using him as a weapon against her was unbearable. Without really thinking about it, she made a decision that would change everything. "Come with me," she said firmly. "You need to get cleaned up and figure out how to save your daughter. My apartment isn't much, but it's safe." David stared at her in shock. You don't understand. These people are dangerous. If they find out you helped me, they'll hurt you too. They'll hurt your family. Then we better make sure they don't find out, Maria replied, surprised by her own courage. Besides, you can't save your daughter if you're dead or back in some warehouse being tortured. During the short drive to Maria's apartment, David explained more about what he'd discovered. Apparently, someone at his company had been using client accounts to wash dirty money for criminals. Millions of dollars were being moved around illegally, made to look like legitimate investments. When David accidentally stumbled across the evidence while working late one night, he'd copied everything to a flash drive before anyone knew what he'd found. The worst part, David said as they pulled into the parking lot of Maria's apartment complex, is that some of the money belongs to pension funds, retirement accounts for teachers, firefighters, regular working people. If this scheme collapses, thousands of families will lose their life savings. Maria parked her car and looked around the dimly lit parking lot. Her building wasn't in the best neighborhood, but it was home. The rent was affordable, the neighbors mostly minded their own business, and her kids felt safe here. Now she was bringing danger right to their doorstep. But what choice did she have? My neighbor Rosa is watching my kids, Maria explained as they walked up the stairs to the second floor. She's probably asleep on my couch by now. We'll have to be quiet. Maria's apartment was small but clean. The furniture was old and mismatched, mostly stuff she'd bought at garage sales or found on the curb. The walls were covered with her children's artwork and family photos. It was the opposite of what David was probably used to, but Maria wasn't embarrassed. This place represented years of hard work and sacrifice. Rosa was indeed asleep on the couch, snoring softly with the TV volume turned low. Maria gently shook her awake. "Everything okay, honey?" Rosa asked, then noticed David standing awkwardly by the door covered in dirt and looking like he'd been in a fight. "Long story," Maria whispered. "Thanks for watching the kids. I'll explain everything tomorrow." After Rosa left, Maria showed David to her tiny bathroom and gave him a clean towel and some of her ex-husband's old clothes that she'd never gotten around to throwing away. While he cleaned up, she made coffee and tried to process everything that had happened in the last hour. When David emerged from the bathroom, he looked almost human again. The clothes were too big for him, but at least he was clean. The bruises on his face were more visible now, dark purple marks that made Maria wince just looking at them. "Thank you," he said simply, accepting a cup of coffee. "I know this is crazy. You don't even know me, and here you are risking everything to help a complete stranger." Maria sat down across from him at her small kitchen table. "You said they have your daughter. I have kids too. I couldn't just leave you there." They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, both lost in their own thoughts. Finally, David spoke again. "The people behind this, they have connections everywhere. Police, judges, city officials. That's how they've been getting away with it for so long. I can't just go to the authorities because I don't know who's involved and who's clean." "What about the FBI?" Maria suggested. "Surely they're not all corrupt." "Maybe not, but how do I contact them without exposing my location? These people think I'm dead right now. If they find out I survived, they'll kill Lisa immediately and then come after me again. And now they'll come after you too for helping me." Maria felt fear creep into her chest, but she pushed it down. "So what's the plan? We can't just sit here doing nothing while your daughter is in danger." David looked at her with something like admiration. "You keep saying we like this is your problem too." "It is my problem now," Maria said firmly. "The moment I decided to help you, it became my problem. Besides, I know this city in ways you probably don't. I clean houses in the rich neighborhoods, I work in restaurants where powerful people eat. I hear things. Sometimes people talk around service workers like we're invisible." David's eyes lit up slightly. "You're right. I've been thinking about this all wrong. I was trying to figure out how to use my connections and my resources, but those are exactly what got me into trouble. What I need is someone who can move around the city without attracting attention, someone these criminals would never suspect." "What exactly are you suggesting?" Maria asked, though she had a feeling she already knew. "Help me gather more evidence. Help me figure out who we can trust. Help me find my daughter." David reached across the table and gently touched her hand. "I know it's asking too much, but I don't have anyone else. And somehow I feel like you might be the only person who can help me save her." Maria looked down at his hand on hers. 3 hours ago, she'd been just another overworked single mom trying to make ends meet. Now she was sitting in her kitchen planning to take on dangerous criminals to save a little girl she'd never met. "Okay," she said quietly. Let's bring your daughter home. The next morning, Maria woke up at 5:30 a.m. like she always did. For a moment, she forgot about everything that had happened the night before. Then she heard David moving around quietly in her living room, and reality came flooding back. She had a wealthy businessman sleeping on her couch. His daughter was missing, and she had somehow agreed to help take down dangerous criminals. When she walked into the kitchen, David was already awake, sitting at her table with his laptop open. He'd somehow managed to connect to her neighbor's Wi-Fi and was typing furiously. Even in her ex-husband's old clothes, he looked focused and determined, like a man on a mission. "Morning," Maria said softly, starting to make coffee. "How long have you been up?" "A couple hours," David replied without looking away from the screen. "I've been trying to trace the money trail from my company's accounts. If I can figure out where the dirty money is going, maybe I can find out who's behind this whole thing." Maria's 10-year-old daughter Katie wandered into the kitchen, rubbing her eyes. She stopped short when she saw David, clearly confused about why there was a stranger in their apartment so early in the morning. "Mom, who's that?" Katie asked, not bothering to whisper. "This is David," Maria said, shooting him a meaningful look. "He's a friend who needed a place to stay last night. He'll probably be here for a few days." Katie studied David with the intense curiosity that only children possess. "Are you poor like us?" she asked bluntly. David looked up from his laptop, clearly caught off guard by the question. Maria felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment, but David just smiled gently. "No, sweetheart, I'm not poor. I usually live in a very different kind of place. But right now I need your mom's help with something important." "What kind of help?" Katie asked, climbing onto a chair across from him. Maria was about to change the subject when David surprised her by answering honestly. "I have a little girl about your age, and some bad people took her away from me. Your mom is helping me figure out how to get her back safely." Katie's eyes went wide. "Bad people took your daughter? Like kidnapping?" "Something like that," David said softly. "But don't worry. Your mom and I are going to fix everything." After Katie went back to her room to get ready for school, Maria sat down with David to figure out their next move. He showed her spreadsheets full of numbers and bank account information that made absolutely no sense to her. "Look, I appreciate that you're trying to involve me," Maria said. "But I barely made it through high school. I don't understand any of this financial stuff." David closed the laptop and looked at her seriously. "You don't need to understand the numbers. What you understand is people and places and how this city really works. That's way more valuable than anything I know about money." He pulled out a piece of paper and started drawing a simple diagram. "Here's what I think is happening. Someone at my company is taking money from legitimate investment accounts and moving it through a series of fake companies. Eventually it gets cleaned up and ends up in the accounts of whoever is running this operation." "Okay, that makes sense," Maria said. "But how does that help us find Lisa? Because these fake companies have to exist somewhere. They need addresses, phone numbers, maybe even real offices to look legitimate. And the people running this operation have to meet somewhere, store things somewhere, keep your daughter somewhere." Maria was starting to see where he was going with this. "So we need to find these places." "Exactly. But I can't do it myself. If any of these people see me, they'll know I'm alive and Lisa will be in even more danger." "But you—" David paused, choosing his words carefully. "You move through the city in ways that are invisible to people like them. You have access to places they'd never think to guard." Over the next few hours, they worked out a plan. Maria would use her various jobs to gather information. Her cleaning work gave her access to office buildings where she could look for suspicious companies. Her job at the diner put her in contact with all kinds of people, including some who might know things about illegal activities in the city. And her third job, working nights at a hotel downtown, gave her access to guest records and overheard conversations. "There's one more thing," David said hesitantly. "I need to access my safety deposit box at First National Bank downtown. That's where I kept copies of all the evidence I found. But if I go there myself, they might be watching the bank," Maria finished. "Smart. But how can I get into your safety deposit box? Don't I need ID and signatures and all that stuff?" David reached into his wallet and pulled out a small key. "You'll need this plus my driver's license, and you'll need to forge my signature." "I know it's asking a lot, but—" "I can't forge signatures," Maria interrupted. "I'm not a criminal." "You're not a criminal," David agreed. "You're trying to save an innocent child. Sometimes good people have to bend the rules to stop bad people from winning." Maria stared at the key in her palm. Everything about this felt wrong and dangerous. She was a single mother trying to provide for her kids, not some kind of undercover agent. But then she thought about Lisa, probably scared and alone somewhere, wondering why her daddy hadn't come to save her yet. "Okay," Maria said finally. "But I want to practice your signature first. And if this goes bad, if I get arrested or something happens to me, you have to promise you'll make sure my kids are okay." "Nothing's going to happen to you," David said, but Maria could hear the uncertainty in his voice. That afternoon, while her kids were at school, Maria walked into First National Bank wearing her best dress and carrying David's ID. Her hands were shaking as she approached the safety deposit box area, but she forced herself to walk confidently, like she belonged there. The bank employee, a middle-aged woman with kind eyes, barely glanced at the ID before leading Maria to the vault. "Haven't seen you in a while, Mr. Chen," she said pleasantly. Maria just nodded and tried to look casual as they went through the process of opening the box. Inside, she found exactly what David had described: a flash drive, several folders full of documents, and some photographs that made her stomach turn. The photos showed meetings between well-dressed businessmen and people who definitely looked like criminals. Back at her apartment, Maria and David spread everything out on her kitchen table. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, email printouts, recorded phone conversations, and photos that clearly showed money laundering on a massive scale. "This is enough to put dozens of people in prison," David said, his voice filled with both hope and fear. "But look at this list of names." Maria scanned the document he handed her. She recognized several names from the news: a city councilman, a federal judge, 2 police captains, and the district attorney. These weren't just random criminals. These were powerful people who could make evidence disappear and witnesses vanish. "No wonder they want you dead," Maria whispered. "This could destroy half the city government, which is exactly why we can't trust anyone in law enforcement right now," David replied. "We need to find Lisa first, then figure out how to expose this safely." Just then, Maria's phone rang. It was her boss at the diner, asking if she could work an extra shift that evening. Maria almost said no, but then she had an idea. "Actually," she told David after hanging up, "this might be perfect. The diner is where all kinds of people go to talk. Businessmen having late dinners, cops grabbing coffee, city workers on their lunch breaks. If there's gossip or rumors about missing kids or suspicious activities, someone at the diner will know about it." That evening, Maria worked her shift with new purpose. She listened carefully to every conversation, paid attention to every customer who seemed nervous or out of place. Around 9 p.m., she struck gold. 2 men in expensive suits were sitting in the corner booth, talking in low voices over coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. One of them kept checking his phone and looking around nervously. "The boss says we need to move the kid again," she heard one of them say. "Keeping her at the warehouse is too risky now that the heat's turned up." Maria's heart started pounding. She forced herself to keep wiping down tables and refilling coffee cups, acting like she wasn't listening to the most important conversation of her life. "Where to this time?" the second man asked. "The old restaurant on Pier 47. It's been closed for months and nobody goes down there at night." "We'll move her tomorrow afternoon." Maria couldn't believe her luck. She knew Pier 47 well. It was an old fishing district that had been mostly abandoned when the new marina opened across town. If Lisa was being held there, it would be isolated enough that no one would hear her call for help, but accessible enough that Maria might be able to get close. When her shift ended, Maria practically ran home to tell David what she'd overheard. For the first time since she'd found him buried in the woods, she saw real hope in his eyes. "Tomorrow we get her back," David said firmly. "Tomorrow we get her back," Maria agreed, praying they weren't making a terrible mistake. The next morning, Maria woke up with a knot in her stomach. Today was the day they would try to rescue Lisa, and everything could go wrong. She lay in bed for a few minutes, listening to her kids getting ready for school in the next room, wondering if this was the last normal morning they would ever have. David was already awake when she walked into the kitchen, studying maps of the pier area on his laptop. He looked like he hadn't slept at all, which was probably true. Dark circles under his eyes made his bruises look even worse, but there was a determined set to his jaw that hadn't been there before. "I've been thinking about this all night," he said without looking up. "We can't just walk in there. These people are dangerous and they're probably armed. If we mess this up, they'll kill Lisa immediately. Maria poured herself coffee with shaking hands. So what's the plan? First, we need to watch the place. Figure out how many people are there when they come and go, what kind of security they have. David pulled up a satellite image of Pier 47 on his screen. According to this, the old restaurant is at the end of the pier. There's only one road in and out, which is good for privacy but bad for escape routes. I know that area, Maria said, sitting down beside him. My ex-husband used to work on the fishing boats before we got divorced. That whole district has been dying for years. Most of the buildings are empty now. They spent the morning planning. David would stay hidden while Maria scouted the location. Her story would be simple if anyone stopped her. She was looking for work. Heard there might be restaurants reopening in the area. It was believable enough, and people rarely paid attention to working-class women looking for jobs. After dropping her kids at school, Maria drove down to Pier 47. The area looked even more run-down than she remembered. Half the buildings had broken windows and weeds grew up through cracks in the parking lots. The old restaurant David had mentioned was a sad-looking building at the very end of the pier, with faded paint and a for lease sign that had probably been there for months. Maria parked her car about 2 blocks away and walked casually through the area, pretending to look at the empty storefronts. She saw 2 men sitting in a black SUV outside the restaurant, both wearing sunglasses and looking bored. Every few minutes, one of them would talk into a phone or radio. As she watched from behind an old dumpster, Maria saw something that made her heart race. A small face appeared briefly in one of the restaurant's upstairs windows. It was only there for a second, but Maria was sure it was a child. Lisa was definitely in that building. That afternoon, Maria met David at a coffee shop near the pier to share what she'd learned. They sat in a corner booth speaking in whispers even though no one else was paying attention to them. 2 guards outside at least, Maria reported. Maybe more inside? And I saw a kid in the upstairs window around noon. David's hands clenched into fists on the table. That has to be her. How do we get past the guards? I've been thinking about that, Maria said. What if we create a distraction? Something that would make them leave their post or at least focus their attention somewhere else? Like what? Maria hesitated, knowing David wasn't going to like her idea. Like a fire. There's a bunch of old wooden buildings nearby. If one of them started burning, the fire department would come, maybe police too. The guards would either have to help or risk looking suspicious by doing nothing. David stared at her. You want to commit arson? I want to save your daughter, Maria said firmly. And sometimes you have to fight fire with fire, literally. They argued about it for 20 minutes, but in the end, they both knew it was their best option. David didn't have any better ideas and time was running out. The men at the diner had said they were moving Lisa that afternoon, which meant this might be their only chance. That evening, as the sun was setting, Maria and David drove back to Pier 47. Maria had stopped at a hardware store and bought a can of paint thinner and some old rags, telling the clerk she was helping a friend strip furniture. Her stomach felt sick about what they were planning. But every time she started to lose her nerve, she thought about Lisa's scared face in that window. They parked several blocks away and walked separately to the pier. David hid behind some old shipping containers where he could watch the restaurant, while Maria made her way to a small warehouse about 100 yards from where the guards were stationed. The warehouse had been empty for months, with broken windows and graffiti covering the walls. Maria checked to make sure no homeless people were sleeping inside, then carefully poured paint thinner on some old newspapers and wooden pallets near the back wall. She lit the rags with a lighter and ran. The fire spread faster than she had expected. Within minutes, orange flames were shooting through the broken windows and thick black smoke was billowing into the evening sky. Maria ran back to where David was hiding, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might burst. Holy cow, David whispered as they watched the warehouse burn. That's bigger than we planned. Sure enough, sirens started wailing in the distance. Fire trucks, police cars, and ambulances were all heading toward the pier. The 2 guards outside the restaurant jumped out of their SUV and started talking excitedly on their radios. This is our chance, Maria said, while they're distracted. But as they started to move toward the restaurant, David grabbed her arm. Wait, look. 3 more men had come out of the building, all of them carrying guns. Instead of being distracted by the fire, they seemed more alert than before, like they suspected the fire was a trick. This isn't going to work, David said. his voice filled with despair. There are too many of them and they're too smart. Maria watched the men for a moment, thinking fast. What if we don't try to sneak in? What if we walk right up to the front door? Are you crazy? Think about it, Maria said urgently. They're expecting someone to try to rescue Lisa, right? They're looking for people hiding in shadows, creeping around. They're not expecting two people to just walk up and knock on the door. What would we say? Maria's mind was racing. You said these people are laundering money through fake companies. What if we pretend to be from one of those companies? What if we say we're there to check on the operation? It was a desperate plan, but David was desperate enough to try anything. They walked confidently toward the restaurant, with Maria slightly behind David like she was his assistant or secretary. Her heart was beating so fast she was sure the guards could hear it. Evening, gentlemen, David said in a businesslike tone as they approached the men with guns. We're here for the scheduled inspection. The guards looked confused and started talking among themselves. One of them made a phone call, speaking too quietly for Maria and David to hear. After what felt like forever, he hung up and nodded. Boss says to let you in, he said, though he still looked suspicious. But make it quick. Maria could hardly believe their plan was working. They walked into the restaurant, trying to look like they belonged there. Inside, the place was even more run down than outside. Tables and chairs were stacked against the walls, and everything smelled like mold and old grease. A man in an expensive suit was waiting for them near the stairs to the second floor. He was older, maybe 50, with gray hair and cold eyes that made Maria's skin crawl. I don't know you, he said, looking back and forth between Maria and David. We're from the accounting firm, David replied smoothly. Quarterly audit as requested. The man stared at them for a long moment, and Maria was sure he was about to call their bluff. Then his phone rang, and he answered it with an annoyed expression. What do you mean the warehouse is on fire? He shouted into the phone. How did that happen? While he was distracted by the phone call, David motioned for Maria to follow him toward the stairs. They climbed quietly to the second floor, where several doors led to what had probably once been private dining rooms. Behind the third door they tried. They found her. Lisa was sitting on a mattress in the corner of a small room, her hands tied behind her back and tears streaming down her face. She looked so much like David that Maria knew instantly it was his daughter. Daddy? Lisa whispered when she saw David, like she couldn't quite believe he was real. I'm here, baby, David said, rushing to untie her hands. I'm here, and I'm going to take you home. But as they helped Lisa to her feet, they heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. The man with the cold eyes was coming up, and he didn't sound happy. We need to go, Maria whispered urgently. Right now? They looked around the room desperately, but there was only one way out, the door they had come through. They were trapped on the second floor of a building full of armed criminals, with a terrified 8-year-old girl and no plan for escape. Daddy, I'm scared, Lisa whispered, clinging to David's arm. It's going to be okay, he promised her, though Maria could hear the fear in his own voice. Maria and I are going to get you out of here safely. As the footsteps got closer, Maria spotted something that gave her hope. The window at the end of the hallway faced the pier, and there was a fire escape ladder attached to the outside of the building. This way, she whispered, leading them toward their only chance of escape. Maria grabbed Lisa's hand and pulled her toward the window at the end of the hallway. Behind them, they could hear the man with cold eyes shouting at his men, his voice getting angrier by the second. Heavy boots were stomping up the wooden stairs, and Maria knew they only had seconds before they were caught. Can you climb? Maria whispered to Lisa, trying to open the old window. It was stuck, painted shut probably years ago. I think so, Lisa said, her voice shaky but brave. David pushed past them and threw his shoulder against the window frame. On the third try, it burst open with a loud crack that echoed through the building. The fire escape ladder was right there, rusty and old but still attached to the wall. You first, David told his daughter, helping her climb through the window. Maria, you go next. I'll be right behind you. But just as Maria was about to follow Lisa onto the fire escape, the door to the hallway slammed open. The man with cold eyes stood there with 2 armed guards, and he looked absolutely furious. Going somewhere? He asked, pulling out a gun of his own. David stepped in front of Maria and Lisa, his arms spread wide like he could somehow protect them with just his body. Let them go, he said firmly. This is between you and me. They don't know anything. The man laughed, but it wasn't a pleasant sound. Oh, I think they know plenty, especially after they helped you break into my operation tonight. He motioned to his guards. "Bring them all downstairs. The boss wants to talk to them." Maria's heart sank. They had been so close to escaping, so close to getting Lisa back to safety. Now they were all going to be prisoners and probably worse. She thought about her own children at home, probably wondering why their mom hadn't come back yet. As the guards forced them down the stairs at gunpoint, Maria noticed that the fire she had started was still burning in the distance. Fire trucks and police cars were everywhere, their flashing lights visible through the restaurant's dirty windows. But they were too far away to help, focused on the warehouse fire instead of what was happening at the restaurant. In the main dining room, another man was waiting for them. He was older than the others, maybe 60, wearing an expensive suit that probably cost more than Maria made in a year. But despite his fancy clothes, there was something cold and dangerous about him that made Maria's skin crawl. "So," the older man said, looking at David with interest. "The dead man walks. I have to admit, I'm impressed. We buried you pretty deep in those woods." "Not deep enough, apparently," David replied, still trying to shield Lisa and Maria with his body. "And you brought friends," the man continued, looking at Maria with calculating eyes. "A cleaning lady from the look of things. How did someone like you get mixed up in this mess, sweetheart?" Maria lifted her chin, refusing to be intimidated. "Someone like me? You mean someone who works for a living instead of stealing from hardworking people?" The man's smile turned colder. "Ah, so you know what this is about. That's unfortunate. It means I can't just let you walk away and forget what you've seen." "What do you want?" David asked, his voice tight with fear and anger. "Originally, I wanted you dead and this whole problem buried with you," the man replied. "But now that you've survived and involved other people, the situation has become more complicated. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to give me all the evidence you've collected, tell me who else knows about our operation, and then you're going to disappear permanently. All three of you." Lisa started crying quietly, and Maria felt her own eyes fill with tears. This couldn't be how it ended. They had come so far, fought so hard to save this little girl, and now they were all going to die anyway. But David surprised everyone by starting to laugh. It wasn't a happy laugh, but something bitter and desperate. "You want to know something funny?" he said, looking directly at the older man. "You're not the only criminal in this room." The man raised an eyebrow. "Excuse me?" David looked at Maria, his eyes filled with shame and regret. "I never told you the whole truth about why I was investigating the money laundering. I didn't stumble across it by accident. I was part of it." Maria stared at him in shock. "What are you talking about?" "For the past 2 years, I've been moving money for these people," David continued, his voice breaking. "Pension funds, retirement accounts, college savings. I helped steal from thousands of families. I told myself it was just business, just numbers on a computer screen. But when I saw the faces of the people whose lives we were destroying, when I realized my own daughter might grow up in a world where people like me could steal her future, I couldn't do it anymore." The older man was smiling now, clearly enjoying David's confession. "So you see, Maria, your hero isn't as innocent as he pretended to be. He's been stealing from people like you for years." Maria felt like she'd been punched in the stomach. All this time, she'd been risking her life to help a man who had been stealing from working families just like hers. People who worked multiple jobs and saved every penny, only to have it stolen by wealthy men in expensive suits. "Is it true?" she asked David, her voice barely a whisper. David nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I'm so sorry, Maria. I know I don't deserve your help, and I know you hate me now. But please don't let them hurt Lisa. She's innocent in all this." For a moment, the room was completely silent except for Lisa's quiet crying and the distant sound of sirens outside. Maria's mind was spinning, trying to process everything she'd learned. The man she'd saved, the man she'd risked everything to help, was a thief who had stolen from people just like her. But as she looked at Lisa, scared and clinging to her father despite everything, Maria realized something important. It didn't matter what David had done in the past. What mattered was that there was an innocent child who needed protection, and Maria was the only one who could provide it. "You know what?" Maria said, turning to face the older man. "I don't care what David did before. All I care about is getting this little girl somewhere safe." The man laughed. "How noble. But it doesn't change anything. You've all seen too much, know too much. I can't let any of you leave here alive." That's when Maria noticed something the criminals had missed. While they'd been talking, the sound of sirens outside had been getting closer. And now she could see flashing lights through the windows, heading straight for the restaurant. Actually, Maria said with a small smile, I think you're wrong about that. The front door of the restaurant burst open, and police officers in tactical gear poured into the room. The criminals reached for their weapons, but they were outnumbered and surrounded before they could draw them. How did you know we were here? The older man demanded as handcuffs were snapped onto his wrists. We didn't just create a distraction with that warehouse fire, Maria explained. While David was confessing everything to you, I was sending text messages to every news reporter and FBI tip line I could find. I told them exactly where to find a money laundering operation and a kidnapped child. David stared at her in amazement. When did you do that? While you were having your dramatic moment, Maria replied. I figured if we were going to die anyway, we might as well make sure these criminals went down with us. An FBI agent approached them as the local police arrested the criminals. Are you Maria Santos? She asked. Yes, that's me. Agent Johnson. We've been tracking this money laundering operation for months, but we never had enough evidence to make arrests. The information you provided tonight, combined with the evidence Mr. Chen collected, is exactly what we needed. As the chaos settled down and paramedics checked Lisa for injuries, David pulled Maria aside. His face was filled with shame and gratitude in equal measure. I know you probably never want to see me again after what I told you in there, he said quietly, but I need you to know that meeting you changed everything for me. Seeing how hard you work, how much you sacrifice for your children, how you risked everything to help a stranger, it made me realize what I'd become. Maria looked at him for a long moment. What are you going to do now? I'm going to testify against everyone involved in this operation. I'm going to help the FBI recover every penny that was stolen, and I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I did. He paused, looking over at Lisa, who was finally smiling again. But first, I'm going to be the father my daughter deserves. 6 months later, Maria was sitting in her kitchen, but everything was different now. The reward money from the FBI had allowed her to quit 2 of her 3 jobs and spend more time with her children. She was even taking night classes at the community college, working toward a degree in criminal justice. David had kept his promise. He had testified against the criminal organization, helped recover millions of dollars in stolen funds, and was now serving a reduced sentence in a minimum security prison. But before his sentencing, he had done something that changed Maria's life forever. He had set up a trust fund for her children's education and paid off her apartment. Not as payment for her silence, he had insisted, but because she had shown him what real courage looked like. Lisa visited sometimes, staying with her grandmother but always asking about Miss Maria and the woman who had helped save her. The little girl was in therapy, working through the trauma of her kidnapping, but she was resilient and surrounded by people who loved her. As Maria sat at her kitchen table, helping her son with his homework, she thought about that night in the woods when she'd found a man buried alive. She had no idea then how much that moment would change both of their lives. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply refuse to look the other way when someone needs help. Even if that someone isn't perfect, even if helping them puts you at risk, sometimes being human means choosing compassion over safety. Maria had learned that heroes don't come from wealth or power or perfect moral records. Heroes come from ordinary people who decide that doing the right thing matters more than doing the easy thing. And sometimes, when you save someone else, you end up saving yourself too.